Hello, welcome to Illuminations with Tiina and Fi, for you who desires to live a life of joy. And in this series, we're going to explore the exciting area of boundaries, an area that Tiina and I are in the middle of learning and experiencing, practicing and developing into habit. So Tiina, boundaries.
Yes, hello. Boundaries, is that your boundaries question mark or boundaries?
Boundaries question mark.
Okay. Well, I think maybe a good place to start is to talk about different kinds of boundaries. I think some boundaries we're all very familiar with, and then other boundaries might be a bit more of a mystery to us. And I think those boundaries can be the ones causing us some challenging emotions and challenging relationships. Anyway, we'll get there. So, types of boundaries. Thinking material boundaries. That's quite a simple one. So you ask me if I want to lend you a book, and I say yes or no. It's my book. Do I want to lend it? And the reason I'm taking the example of books is because sometimes I struggle with lending my books to other people. Other examples, it's like a toothbrush. That's usually kind of, everybody knows, well, a toothbrush is very personal. That one, you don't share that. So there's kind of boundaries, material boundaries. Then, of course, we've got physical boundaries. Still one that's fairly easily kind of talked about and understood. Somebody comes and stands very, very close to you and invades your personal space. We all have different, where we're comfortable, a comfortable kind of zone. And if somebody kind of comes too close and we don't know them, we might want to take a step back. So physical boundaries. Then we've also got sexual boundaries, being able to say yes or no to sexual advances and, sexual activities. Emotional boundaries. Now, emotional boundaries, we might start getting into an area where those kind of, what do we say? The boundary itself starts kind of being fuzzy. And what we have to kind of remember all the time with all kinds of boundaries is that they're different for all of us, And with emotional boundaries, one typical example could be that, for example, that I take on other people's emotions, that I make them my own, and then I suffer because of them, right? Or my partner comes home after a hard day at work and he's in a really, really bad mood and thinks that the world is awful and life is crap and everything. And then my mood is affected by that. So I live into his reality of his day instead of going, okay, honey, I know do you want to talk about it? But still keeping that distance, that it's not about me. So those are a few kinds of boundaries. Are there any that you want to add into the mix or comment on anything that I've said?
No, I was just thinking there are also sometimes with the removal of boundaries, isn't there? So if you're going somewhere and you want to connect with someone, that you actually maybe remove some boundaries that are keeping you away from connection. So boundaries are interesting. We're going to be talking about obviously having boundaries for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I was thinking about I think something Brene was saying, boundaries is when you feel with the person but not for them. She was talking about actually empathy. Yeah. And because for her, compassion, empathy, generosity are all linked to boundaries. You can't have compassion without boundaries. You can't have generosity without boundaries. And in a way, you can't have empathy, which is how you're describing your partner and he or she bringing something into the home and you be in your place, but you can be with them. Exactly. Yes. So for me, boundaries have been quite an interesting learning because I I often, I think in the past, didn't express my boundaries. So Brene talks about boundaries just being what is okay and what isn't okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting because lending books that you use as an example is something I've learned from. So I don't actually lend books anymore because that's my boundary. I buy books for clients and I'll send them like you do. But what I don't do is lend a favourite book, because I become very attached to my books, as pretty evident behind the screen here. There's a whole bookcase of them. And I've realised that when I've given books, I could probably tell you the 5 books I've given that haven't been given back. So, you know, there's some letting go there, I know. But boundaries. So that you're right. So I now know I don't actually give the book. I say, you know, so therefore I'm removing myself for taking responsibility for that person experiencing the book. I can recommend it, but it's their responsibility to then go and buy it. And so that's different, you know, it's different. So yeah, so I kind of appreciate the book one, indeed.
Good. I wasn't the only one then who's a bit like,
nah. That's why if you lend me a book, I'm really good at giving it back. Really good.
Yeah.
And I do borrow books, but I make sure I give them back. You know, even if relationships and friendships kind of fizzle or change, I'll always give back the book, post it or something with a loving note, you know. But yeah, that's definitely, so yeah, so boundaries in lending is an interesting one. And I think what happens for me is that's just a high level example of, you know, something physical, you're right. But what I was also not particularly good at, let's just be blunt, was about my time. So it's my time that is
time
the one
boundaries.
I'm learning. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was cutting you off.
So I'd agree to everything, you know, and then gradually realised I couldn't do it all, and usually fib, if I'm honest, to get out of the situation. Which I'm learning to not now. I'm learning to show up authentically, but I'm also much more careful about what I commit myself to. And you know, saying, you know, I'm sorry, I can't do that, is quite hard. And Brene, she talks about how, you know, so often saying no to someone, it's the fear of the judgment, you know. And that's quite an interesting one. So it makes me realise how much I do define sometimes my behaviour by the judgment of others. So to actually say, look, I'm really sorry, I can't do that, but for the real reason, as opposed to making something up, like I'm completely overcommitted at the moment, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, rather than saying, well, I don't know, some fib. So, yeah.
I think the time one, I think, is very interesting because from me personally, but also kind of looking at the women that I work with, there's this partly I've been asked, which is so lovely. Somebody wants me to help, or somebody wants me to do this, or somebody wants me to participate, or wants to meet up, whatever it is, you know. And then there's if I say no, is that the fear of rejection then comes in, but also kind of the guilt and like, am I being selfish now? Like, should I just say yes to everything? Because if I don't, then that's selfish behavior. But of course, what it then means is that you're not feeling very good. Your energy levels are really, really low, and you don't have time to do any of the things that maybe you love doing, and eventually you become very resentful.
Yeah.
You know, and you start blaming other people for your lack of boundaries or lack of the ability of saying no, or, you know, it's like, no, I'm not interested, or no, I can't, or maybe later. And also there also comes in the time and the relationship boundaries of, I don't know, maybe most of us have experienced that friend who calls up and says, hey, do you want to meet up for a drink? And go, somewhere inside we're like, oh, really don't want to, but okay, because you know that 3 hours of spending that with that person is going to be them offloading their stuff onto you. They're going to walk off feeling really great. You're going to walk off feeling really low. And still you're saying yes to that. And it's a total energy thief. And it's a relationship that doesn't serve you. You become resentful. You start hating that person. But under it all is like your inability to kind of say no.
Yeah, and that's I've emphasised this book. I think I've said to you, Gillian Anderson has just produced this wonderful book, which is the Manifesto, and in here they have about setting boundaries, and they say no is an essential part of our vocabulary. Setting boundaries is one of the ways we define ourselves. It lets others know where we begin and end, and it's particularly important to us if we're actually given to people pleasing. Which is what you're describing there. So saying no when someone wants you to say yes can feel brutal, particularly if you're not used to saying it. And then they talk about the golden rule, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, how to go about doing it. But they kind of like get you to understand, you know, of course others won't necessarily want you to hear your no. People will want you to do what they want you to do, but that won't serve anyone, and it just leaves you feeling angry and resentful. So yes, indeed.
And it really is in healthy relationships. There are healthy boundaries from both sides. And sometimes, you know, I think you've set some boundaries up, and at first I was like, what?
Yeah.
She's changing here. What's happening? And the uncomfortableness of, okay, understanding the reasons why. And, you know, it's like, okay, that's fine. You know, and it doesn't mean that every time that you kind of lay down a new boundary with someone maybe you've known a long time, that it will just be hunky-dory and accepted. Sometimes there might be a discussion about it. But at least, you know, and I think, so I'm jumping a little bit now. So in the learning process of setting boundaries, when we don't have the know-how, and we don't maybe have the language, we don't know how to do it. And then when we start doing it, and I know we've talked about this and we both experience it, suddenly it becomes like, okay, I'm going to set this boundary, and it's like aggressive. I'm not doing this anymore. Wow, 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 wow. And the other person's like, oh, right, this is the first time I've ever heard about this. You know, because it's like been this internal struggle for such a long time. And then, you know, not knowing how to do it, it just comes out like a thunderstorm, you know?
Mine doesn't come out, it's not really come out like a thunderstorm. Mine comes out a little bit sniffy.
Okay.
That's what happens with me. I mean, if I've got to that point, then I'm not putting a boundary down. I've gone beyond it for me. So if I'm trying, don't like the language, if I'm setting a boundary for the first time with someone, it can come out a little bit snipey, you know, and we'll look at how next, and I'm learning that one. I've got some great language that I can share in the next episode that I have picked up that have been brilliant, and I've used them. But yeah, I kind of, it comes out a bit like uncomfortable, and occasionally I end up apologizing, so it comes out me not valuing myself in a way. And so so it is interesting. I mean, also there's the boundaries, isn't it? Like the boundaries of saying yes and no, I think is, you know, and a friend of mine recently said to me, you know, what are boundaries? And I kind of like fumbled around and came up with some examples. And Brene literally says boundaries are saying what's okay and what's not okay. And of course it is. That's so simple. But she talks beautifully. She says, she calls it big. I don't know if you remember big, but she talks about big. So it's boundaries that keep my integrity. And I've always loved the word integrity, but boundaries that keep my integrity so that I can then be generous. And that is so hard to get your head around until you start practicing it, because of course, if you keep a boundary, you know, and we'll talk about how next time, but if you have a boundary that keeps your integrity, because that's really important, you know, it's in line with your values, then of course you stop the resentment, disappointment, expectation, you know, and you can then be with the person and be generous with them in that time as well. changes the mindset, which is very true.
Yeah,
Very true.
And it's also practicing self-love and self-worth, and actually gaining that feeling of, oh, I value myself. I'm worth something. It's
that we'll look at, I'm sure, more deeply in our second episode, because you're right. It's like a jigsaw, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been practicing boundaries now for a while, and I say practicing. Sometimes I get it bang on, and sometimes I make it a complete balls up. But I do go back and apologise, and I explain. And I know a lot of my family are looking at me going, sorry? I said, at the weekend with my brother and his wife, I said, oh, let's have something. And I said, that's me putting down a boundary, which became quite a joke, but that was brilliant because it became part of the humour. And so they started putting down boundaries as well, which was great. So, they started to understand that there are boundaries. So, boundaries. What time are we on?
We are out of time.
We are out of time, Tiina. Yes. Thank you. So if you'd like to subscribe, or if you'd like to share, please do. In episode 2, we're going to be exploring how you can start to put down boundaries. And I'm sure Tiina and I have got some good tips, and I've picked up some other good tips as well along the way that we can share. So yes, good. Thank you, Tiina.
Thank you.
See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye now.